From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
6 Democratic House staffers are arrested while protesting Chuck Schumer's office as 8 House offices move to unionize. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial writer Monet Ukwe-Barua. Welcome to you both. 17 congressional staffers on Monday had a sit-in at the office of Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. They were holding signs saying things like climate policy now, keep negotiating, Chuck, our farms are flooding, and 6 of them were eventually arrested after refusing to leave the office when asked. They included employees of Congresswoman Cori Bush, Congressman Ro Khanna of California, Jamal Bowman of New York, and Jamie Raskin of Maryland, Ilhan Omar of Minnesota. And here's a clip of a staffer for Cori Bush telling an NBC reporter what he wanted as he was being loaded into a Capitol Police van.
What exactly are you asking from Schumer that he's not doing?
To reopen the negotiations on climate reconciliation package and then to actually pass climate legislation during the Democrats' 2 years in power.
And why protest Schumer's office and not Joe Manchin?
Because there's always going to be a sheep that strays away from the herd. It's the job of leadership to get the party together and actually pass what people need.
Kim, what do you make of these staffers? They want Chuck Schumer to reopen climate negotiations. And as you heard there, he was asked, why not protest Joe Manchin's office? And he said there's always one sheep that's going to stray from the herd, and it's leadership's role to keep everybody in line. I mean, does this make sense as a tactic?
Well, it's unfortunately a tactic that is happening more and more. Don't forget that back in November of 2018, you had a number of climate activists who did a sit-in at Nancy Pelosi's office, and no less than Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stopped by to join them for a time. Now, no one, as far as I know, was arrested there. You've had climate protesters blocking traffic in Maryland recently over the 4th of July, demanding that Biden declare a climate emergency. You're seeing this in other topic areas as well, too. Just, I think it was last week, we had a number of members of the House, including Ilhan Omar and AOC, arrested for joining in an abortion protest outside of the Supreme Court that was blocking the thoroughfare. So this is a tactic, I guess, to get attention. But no, it's not going to work. It's absolutely ludicrous. I can promise you that Chuck Schumer would be passing a climate bill, and an enormous climate bill, tomorrow if he could get the votes. He can't. Joe Manchin has made very, very clear that he's not going to go down there, at least not at this moment, and at least not given the numbers on inflation, etc. And so it's kind of a professional version of a temper tantrum, and it does get some headlines, but it's certainly not going to persuade the party to get on board with this. If Democratic staffers want some sort of climate legislation, go out and help elect more Democratic senators who will vote for it in the Senate. Otherwise, civil disobedience, again, it gets you headlines, but it doesn't move the ball.
And one question I had was whether their bosses, the protesters' bosses, were okay with this tactic. And I guess we don't know that for sure, but whether or not they were okay with it or approved it at the time, they are coming out in support of it. Here's Rep. Ro Khanna on Twitter. I stand in solidarity with all of the staffers, including those in my office, who peacefully protested for climate action today. Protecting our planet is not a radical idea. Here's Ilhan Omar. I'm not just supportive of the staff who protested for climate action today, including my own. I'm proud. And Monet, I mean, I get that they're in a separate chamber, so there's not really a working relationship between members of the House necessarily and members of the Senate leadership. But I was imagining, as I was hearing about this news story, the calls going out from Schumer's office, Schumer's chief of staff, to these House chief of staff saying, what are you guys doing here?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I think those of us who have been following this story have been watching the reporting and waiting to see if anyone has been able to uncover evidence that this was approved by those House members. I haven't seen that so far, but based on those endorsements that you just read from some of the House members who these staffers were working for, it does seem as if they were certainly on board with the cause if they didn't necessarily give sign-off to it. But I do think it's fascinating to see this kind of bright, glaring evidence of the internal rifts among the Democrats. Obviously, they've controlled the House for a long time now, and they have been really pushing all sorts of progressive legislation. They've managed to get a few things through and signed by the president, but their agenda has really stalled, and mostly because of Joe Manchin in the Senate. They have such a slim majority, of course, that Manchin is able to stall any of these large controversial pieces of legislation that he chooses. And so they are completely frustrated by the Senate for not pushing harder to get some of these agenda items through. So I think in the run-up to the midterms, you're probably going to see a lot more of this as progressive members are wanting to go back to their home districts and be able to run on big accomplishments so that they can brag about to their base. It's very frustrating to them to have, all of their progress held up by what they see as one man in their eyes.
Another interesting piece of this dynamic is that according to some reports, one of these Democratic House staffers who was arrested is the president of the Congressional Workers Union. And there's been a push by some House offices to unionize in recent days after the House passed a resolution on collective bargaining back in May. Kim, can you give us an update on what's going on here?
There's long been a discussion about allowing some form of unionization in Congress, but Congress had always wisely refused to give it because of a few of the problems I will mention. But anyway, the House Democrats under Nancy Pelosi felt this would fit good with their pro-union agenda and their equity agenda, so they narrowly passed it in May. And what we saw last week were staffers from 8 different offices, very progressive members. Again, these were folks like Cori Bush and Ilhan Omar staffers who filed petitions with a somewhat obscure agency that deals with workplace rights within Congress. And those petitions asked to begin the process, allow them to ultimately have a vote to unionize. A couple of things. First of all, I think it's notable that there were only 8 because there were most of the Democratic Party ended up voting for this resolution. So far, you've only seen this handful actually try to bring it to the fore. This is still a very, very bad idea, and as evidenced by who is supporting it. It was funny you mentioned some of those members who came out and said they were proud of their staff for protesting. We've had a number of the same members come out and say that they're proud of their staffers for engaging in this unionization, and that shows you everything that is wrong with this process. Could you imagine Jeff Bezos, the head of Amazon, encouraging workers to unionize? That is not something bosses want. There's supposed to be an adversarial relationship here. And the fact that you've got these members who are in favor of it just goes to show that one of the reasons we don't like public sector unionization is that the guys who are supposedly negotiating with the union often are in favor of unions or owe their office to unions. So they're essentially sitting on the same side of the table.
Well, let me start with the number 8, which I was also struck by as Kim was. And maybe this is just the first 8. We should say that. Maybe this is the vanguard. And there are other people in other offices who are waiting to see how it will work, waiting to see if those 8 offices make what they perceive as gains before they file forms to do their own unions. But it also made me think, Monet, what do the staffers in Nancy Pelosi's office have against unionizing? Or how about Hakeem Jeffries, the Democratic caucus chairman? You'd think that those people would be all for getting on board this liberal policy and putting their money, I guess, where their mouth is.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. If I had to bet right now, I would say it's just early, and you probably will see a few more offices in the House of Representatives start to organize a little bit and probably do so with the support of the elected representatives. But I do think that one of the things that has sort of restrained an explosion of organizing activity among these congressional offices, that the cost-benefit analysis doesn't really shake out. And what I mean is that, so look at the potential cost of organizing. You are basically sort of portraying yourself as being in an adversarial relationship with your boss in a way that is, somewhat disruptive and somewhat embarrassing potentially to these elected representatives, basically having their staffers even give the suggestion that workplace conditions, pay, things like that are not up to snuff. And so they have to think about that. And I think that's something that probably has prevented a lot of the House Democrats from basically encouraging their staffs to get organized. But on the other side of the ledger, look at the potential benefits, and they really don't seem to pan out. These elected representatives do have some wiggle room to change the pay of their staffers. They have, I believe, a general budget, and so they can kind of move money here and there to give raises as they choose. But there is a cap, a maximum on what people are able to earn in these offices, and they do have limited budgets to some degree. And so it's not as if these Hill staffers stand to win incredible raises by driving a hard bargain against their bosses. And so I think the organizing that we have seen is more politically symbolic. Basically, they're just trying to show that they are allies of the labor movement and are joining it. But I don't know how much it's going to actually change in terms of the circumstances for these Hill staffers. And there is a big potential downside in terms of just kind of signaling an adversarial relationship and disruption within these offices.
I agree that it seems to me that Congress is a very odd place for an adversarial employment relationship. And you think of the classic examples of unionizing, it's a place like an auto factory where you have people on the floor that are kind of cogs in the machine. They're making the stuff, they're making the things work. They don't really have direct contact with management. It's a huge organization, hundreds or thousands of employees. And you contrast that with these house offices where they might have a dozen or a couple of dozen staffers, if that, and they are directly working with the boss day to day. And you start to think, Kim, about what is going to be their leverage in this negotiation. I mean, are they going to slow down legislation, a work stoppage here? And what happens? What's the public policy effect if some people in these offices, the congressmen that are running these offices, start to suspect that their chief of staff, their press aide, isn't really on their side, doesn't really have their best interests at heart?
You mentioned that one of the people who was arrested in the Schumer protest is the president of the Congressional Workers Union. And I think that ought to alarm everyone, because among the things, for instance, that they could potentially negotiate over, I agree with Monet that there are some complex questions of how this would actually work with pay, but you can certainly do questions of workplace conditions, hiring conditions on whether or not you can be fired. I mean, this is a good question. Are you going to negotiate with your boss that you can go and whenever you want protest a senator's office and get arrested, but there will be no ramifications in terms of your employment in the office? Or as you said, sit downs, slow downs of work. Here's another big concern, which doesn't necessarily have to do with what staffers are negotiating. But remember, a lot of these people are tasked with working on high profile legislation, many of which could have provisions that could hurt or hinder unions overall. Where is their allegiance? Is it to the member that they are working for and the body for whom legislative text they are creating? Or are they going to take that otherwise proprietary information and feed it to people in the broader union movement so that they can preemptively go and lobby and make sure it doesn't happen? There are all kinds of very complex questions. And it's one of the reasons why for many, many decades, even Democrats like FDR opposed public sector unionization, because their argument was that there is people who are working for the United States government they have a particular sort of duty, as it were, to society that is different than that attends someone who, for instance, is working on that automotive line you mentioned, Kyle. They're in a different category. There are questions of conflicts of interest in negotiations, given that unions play a role in politics, and that therefore it just wasn't worth going there.
Hang tight. We'll be right back. You're listening to Potomac Watch from the Wall Street Journal.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. It seems to me that a much easier solution to some of the complaints about working on Capitol Hill is just to raise the salaries on Capitol Hill. Congress could do that if it wanted to. And we know that Congress is full of 70-year-olds, but the secret that I think a lot of people don't know if they aren't in Washington, aren't roaming the halls ever, is that the place is run by 20-year-olds. And a lot of them go into these jobs for a short time. They cycle out. And you could make an argument that it shouldn't be that way, that these should be competitive jobs that people want to stay in for their careers in order to ensure that there's a stable staff, stable policy expertise. It's not a revolving door. People don't go into these congressional offices for a couple years and then cycle out to think tanks or somewhere. And there's a report from January in Roll Call, and it says that there's a group called Issue 1 that analyzed data on working in Congress, found staff assistants had a median income of about $39,000 per year, which means half or below that. Press assistants, legislative correspondents had a median income of about $44,000 a year, which mean, again, half are below that. And so, Monet, I mean, I take the complaints that some of these unionization pushes are raising, I take them seriously, but why can't Congress just get together and raise raise people's pay if it needs to.
It's a fair point. I definitely would add the caveat that there certainly is an upside, I think, to the churn that you see on Capitol Hill in the sense that we don't necessarily want to have a kind of permanent congressional staffer class sort of with interests of their own who come in with much more knowledge and expertise than the elected representatives and are kind of able to run the show. And there are some upsides to having a sort of a fresh blood in there and people who come in with sort of relatively short amount of experience in terms of restraining them from kind of acting independently of the elected representatives. But I do also see the benefit of having experienced workers on the Hill. I do think that a lot of people probably, if you asked them how much do senior congressional staffers get paid, they probably would give a number that's higher than the actual number, and it does contribute to probably some discord in Congress to have that. And so there's a reasonable case to be made for increasing the pay of these staffers. And I would point out that we did see in the past legislative session federal workers, so people who are in the bureaucracy, got a much larger than usual raise, and that was to keep up with inflation. And so that, I think, kind of starts to make the case already for saying if we're going to pay the bureaucrats a little bit more, we can expect that congressional staffers should be offered a little bit more too. And I do think that that's something that Republicans would probably be open to. Generally, they want to be able to hire talented candidates. And so in the next session, if Republicans do retake the House, I wouldn't be surprised if they were to say, well, we don't like the possibility of our staffers unionizing and we're going to repeal that resolution. But in return for doing so, maybe we will start to move some legislation to get a little bit more pay. So we'll see how that shakes out in a future Congress.
Kim, do you think that's likely that this resolution will get repealed if Republicans take control of the House? And until then, what's the status quo? I mean, if there's an office that wants to unionize, but the congressman at the top of it doesn't think that's a good idea for whatever reason, can he block it? And personally, I mean, I would love to hear from some of these other Democratic offices, Democratic officials, of why they're not going that route for now, whether they just think that there's a problem with this adversarial relationship in Congress, as we've discussed.
So far as I know, there is no way for an individual House member to block an effort by staff to unionize. That was, in fact, what was essentially granted in that resolution in May. We'll see how many more offices of Democratic lawmakers go ahead with something like this. And I think that there might be some argument that the 8 that went ahead are sort of proving as a test case. There are a lot of really complex issues that still need to be sorted out. For instance, this obscure agency I told you about, the Office of Workplace Rights in Congress, they've got to work out whether or not those petitions that they've been filed, do they cover the correct staff members? Do they have a correct bargaining unit? Are they including senior management type people in the office in that bargaining unit because they should otherwise be excluded? Maybe when some of those questions are sorted out and there are a few elections, you might see more offices move to do this. But nobody yet even knows what the time frame of that is, because at the end of the process of this group deciding whether or not you are properly set up to have a union vote, then must have that union vote. It's unlikely that you will see any staff of any Republican members move to do this because they are essentially ideologically opposed to the idea. And that's why you are also very likely to see, should Republicans take the House, that this would be one of their top and initial votes that they take to get rid of this resolution and return things to the prior status quo.
Just to step back a little bit and reflect on the unhealthiness of this dynamic is maybe the way to put it. You have Democratic House staffers protesting the offices of Democratic senators. It reminds me a little bit of some of the meltdowns we've seen in progressive organizations, like the Sierra Club, the Guttmacher Institute. There was an Intercept report a month or so ago, and it talked to some of the executive directors leading these organizations. And here's what one of the anonymous executive directors said: "A lot of the staff that work for me, they expect the organization to be all the things. A movement, okay. Get out the vote, okay. Healing, okay. Take care of you when you're sick, okay. Can you get your love and healing at home, please? But I can't say that. They would crucify me," unquote. And a similar move, there's a social democratic social scientist named Rui Teixeira, who spent many years at the Center for American Progress, a progressive think tank, and in the last couple of weeks he's announced that he's moving to a conservative think tank, the American Enterprise Institute, just for similar reasons. He described some of the internal politicking at his former employer as just cloud cuckoo land, unquote. He added, "The fact that nobody is willing to call BS, it just freaks me out." And Monet, it does seem like there's something going on here with these young staffers on the Hill in these organizations, that an older generation of employees and an older generation of management president might term very simply as insubordination.
Yeah, that's right. I think something going on here is an understatement. And I think it's really ironic that you used quotation from The Intercept to begin this discussion, because it reminds me of what Glenn Greenwald, one of the founders of The Intercept, said about the place when he decided to depart. And he was citing all the same reasons, the idea that some of these younger employees were pushing this rigid progressive line, so rigid that Greenwald himself, an arch progressive, was not willing to remain in place there. And we saw very similar things from other journalists, liberal journalists, leaving their own publications and institutions because they felt as if this new generation was just much too unreasonable, much too demanding, and was pushing a kind of woke office culture that was stifling their ability to actually be creative. And so this is something that obviously all Americans have seen throughout just about every institution. Probably started in academia, has spread through journalism, and now we're really seeing it play out in government. But I think everyone is just waiting and seeing, are some of these managers going to actually step up and be willing to reassert the traditional principles of their industries and basically restrain some of the impulses coming from their young employees, or are they just going to let, the junior employees run roughshod over the place?
But last thought here, I mean, it is a fascinating dynamic, and it's getting a little bit more attention than it was a few months ago. But it seems like the Republican divides are taking up a lot of the attention, and I don't deny that they exist. We have President Trump and Vice President Mike Pence in Washington, D.C., giving dueling speeches today. But there are also some pretty significant divides on the Democratic side of the aisle, and we'll end with a clip from one of those Congresswomen, Cori Bush, talking to a reporter for KSDK.
Do you want to see Joe Biden run for a second term?
She's got to go.
Yeah, that's an easy question. That's not going to take long. Do you want to see Joe Biden run?
I don't want to answer that question because I don't want to answer that question.
Okay.
He's the president and he has the right to run for a second term. Absolutely. I'd rather you not do that answer.
You got like 2 minutes to be in the car.
Yeah, I know. I got to get to the.
Well, thanks very much.
The other thing.
So it was a little quiet there, but if you heard it, the reporter asked the question and the staffer says, she's got to go. So, Kim, it does seem like there are some pretty serious divides on the Democratic side, too, and we'll give you the final word.
Republican divides always get all the attention because that's what the media likes to focus on because they don't like Republicans. But the Democratic divides have been just as dramatic over the past, I'd say, decade and are being equally debilitating. And everything we've been talking about is a good example of this. The progressive wing of the Democratic Party remains the minority of that party. And if you need proof of that, go back and look at the last Democratic primary in which the vast majority of Democratic voters ended up rallying to make sure that they didn't get Bernie Sanders as a candidate, and they ended up getting Joe Biden, who presented himself as a centrist, even if that's not how he's been governing. Yet this progressive wing, nonetheless, it gets all the headlines, it gets all the attention, and it has become this driving factor in all the debates and discussions that the Democratic Party is having internally and the decisions that it's making. And it's also become, as you mentioned, this whole woke wing of the party is also driving these agenda items that it turns out are incredibly unpopular among the average public out there, whether it's things like critical race theory in schools, which has really annoyed parents, whether it's the trans debate and men participating in women's sports, which is pretty universally condemned by the American public, whether it's cancel culture, which Americans don't like, they like free speech. These things have kind of come to almost be this reflection of the party, even though the party is in fact trying to engage in other more substantive questions. That's a real problem for Democrats going into the midterms.
Thank you, Kim and Monet. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. And if you like the show, please hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast app. We'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.